Ladies and gentlemen, Frank Chase back with you one more time. As you know, I have announced that my new book, Kleptomaniac, will hit the streets on June the 1st. So I hope you are excited about this, and we're going to share a little bit of information about what you will read in my new book coming out on June 1st. That's right, June 1st, Kleptomaniac, Who's Really Robbing God Anyway? Well, since you probably are anticipating a good read, and I can say for myself that I enjoyed writing it and I enjoyed discussing the topic, and I hope many of you out there will enjoy reading the topic and starting a conversation in the world of giving and tithing. So, I want to share some of the chapters in the book with you right now because they're going to be pretty interesting to what you will learn about this subject that has really been going on for centuries. Well, as you know, with any book, every book has a story, a backstory. And I have a backstory that I did not necessarily share all the details in the book about how and why I started this tithing journey, but I did put some information in chapter 1 titled My Story for Writing This Book. On chapter 1, we'll give you some details on what happened, some personal information, and what happened at the previous church I was at as I began my journey into discovering the new information the Bible really says about tithing. And so you should find that pretty exciting, and also pretty disappointing, I guess, because I shared some disappointments I had in the process of my journey. And so I wanted to let you know that chapter 1 is a little bit about my story. Um, Chapter 2. Now, for any book, anybody who writes a book about any subject, you have to first establish an empirical definition or your thesis. And so I did in chapter 2 by defining a lesson in necessary tithe definitions. So I went back to the original language to define the tithe in its original language and what it meant and the definitions, because you can't argue a theological position unless you have an empirical definition to work from. And I established that definition, and I went from there throughout the rest of the book to define the tithe and some of the other aspects of tithing that you will learn throughout this book. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, you will not be disappointed about what you will learn. Whether you agree or disagree with my position, you will also learn a great deal of history about Christianity, about the church, and all kinds of other things that may have happened in reference to tithing and giving. Now, we also know that the tithe is often tied to Abraham. So in chapter 3, I discuss Abraham's tithe before the law and the established covenants. That's going to be a key important element in establishing my argument throughout the book, because we have to talk about why Abram's tithe has been so important to many tithe proponents today, and the covenants that existed at that time, because now people teach that tithing is a covenant of today. Well, you will learn in chapter 3 what that position really is and what the covenants are. In chapter 4, I'm going to talk about a little bit about Abraham's life. And chapter 4 is titled The Life of Abraham and His Father, Terah. So there is some backstory about Abraham and the history behind Abraham and why he and his father left the land that they were in and what was going on during that time period. So you're going to get some historical analysis on that. And let's see, chapter 5. Well, chapter 5 is probably one of the kind of odd chapters of the book, because I talk about chapter 5 is titled Jacob's Tithe Proposal. Now, you might not know about that, but Jacob did offer a tithe proposal. And so if tithing was actually mandated, why would Jacob offer a tithe proposal if the law had already established before the law that a tithe was required? So you're going to get some information about that. In chapter 6 is titled Show Me the Money. I'm sure you probably remember the movie Jerry Maguire. Well, I am going to show you all the money in the Bible. And in chapter 6, I really discuss a lot of aspects about money and how money was used in the Old Testament. And so some of the sub-chapters in chapter 6, I'll give you a few of them here. Does God establish money tithing in Genesis? Did God require money tithing in Numbers? And one last one, money is mentioned once in Esther. And then I end the chapter 6 with planting seed versus planting money. You're going to find that kind of interesting and maybe somewhat amusing because of how I explain seed. So look out for chapter 6. Chapter 7, I begin to talk about the tithe in Israel. So that's chapter 7, the tithe in Israel. And I begin to break down tithing, the kinds of tithes, how many tithes, whether there was 1, 3, or not. And so you will get an enlightenment in that particular aspect. Chapter 8. Now, chapter 8 deals with some information that you probably have never heard of. So we want to talk about in chapter 8, that's titled, Did the Levites Work Full-Time or Part-Time in the Temple? And the reason why I asked that question is because many pastors today work full-time, but we want to do some comparison with the Levites to pastors today and find out if there is any correlation. We know the Levites did work in the temple, but did they work full-time? So that is going to be answered in chapter 8. Okay, let's go on to chapter 9. You've probably heard something about a doctrine called first fruits. Well, chapter 9 is titled, Can Money Be Required as First Fruits? Well, we don't know that, do we? Or you might have heard that tithing is first fruits. Is it really? Well, we're going to break that down in a lot of detail and explain what first fruits really is. So you're going to get some education on that subject. Chapter 10. Now, chapter 10 is going to be pretty exciting because we're going to talk about Malachi. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Malachi 3 and 10 has always been the hot button scripture used every Sunday in the church about robbing God. So Malachi chapter 10 is the smokescreen for tithing. And one of the subchapters and subtitles in chapter 10 is the church the storehouse? You don't want to miss reading that part because I'm going to break that down for you also. Chapter 11. Chapter 11, how to refute unbiblical tithing statements. You've heard a lot of them over the years, and I have heard a lot of them over the years. And so I took a part of my experience to define some of those aspects in this particular chapter, and I examined some of the tithing statements, and I either confirm them or refute them by biblical evidence based on the land, language, and the literature of the Hebrew people. Okay, chapter 12 is titled, Giving in the Gospels. Is there such a thing? Well, I'm going to examine a lot of the giving examples in the Gospels, and you're going to get a rich informational history about that. Chapter 13, okay, is titled, Did Paul convert the tithe to money? Now, we're going to do a lot of examination of Paul and his views on giving, his views on offerings, his views on support, and that's going to be a real good examination of what Paul believed about financial support. And chapter 14 goes into even more detail because we talk about 1 Corinthians. Chapter 14 is titled, Giving to the Needy Saints. And so we're going to examine those aspects of scripture where Paul was addressing the Corinthians about their giving effort and how that correlates to today. And can we use those examples as mandatory examples for tithing? Chapter 15 is titled, A Discussion of Paul's Work History and Ministry. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to examine all of Paul's examples of work and why he did work and his background as a tent maker and how much he made as a tent maker, and was that a lucrative business or not? And so now in chapter 16, we're going to look at New Testament giving principles versus Old Testament tithing. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you some examples of New Testament giving versus Old Testament tithing, and whether or not the New Testament actually demands anyone to pay 10% of their income for a lifetime until they die. Now, there are giving examples in the New Testament that require us to give, but is anything in the New Testament based on percentage? Does Paul teach percentage giving? Does John, does any of the apostles, does First Timothy, does Timothy teach it? Does any of the 12 apostles teach anything related to percentage giving based on a 10% principle? And you're going to find a lot of information that's going to be enlightening to you on that. And there are going to be some bibliography in my conclusion. And I think you will find the book very, very insightful. And I hope you get something from it, because I wrote this book for a reason. And I want this book to be a teaching tool that every believer can examine and talk about as they discuss giving in the New Testament. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'll end it here. So you stay tuned and keep a lookout for June the 1st. And if anything changes on the date, I will let you know. And the book will be on all of the websites that sells books and on Amazon. And you will be able to get it from my website, which will be, I'll let you know about that soon as it becomes available. So ladies and gentlemen, have a good evening and stay tuned for Kleptomaniac, Who's Really Robbing God Anyway, on June the 1st. Thank you.